So please welcome our first keynote speaker at the 30th anniversary of SABIS, Dr. Gabor Mate.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I understand that there are about 100 people here in the room who are specifically concerned with head injuries, brain injuries, those that have suffered brain injuries, and those that are to care for them. And both groups will have known that the stress that comes along with either having a brain injury or looking after somebody with brain injury. And I'll address both kinds of stresses. For those of you that are not affected directly by head injury, there's still the same issues, and everything I say will also apply, I think you'll find, to your personal lives. Especially in our society, which, for a whole lot of reasons, imposes a lot of stress on people. Stresses that, number one, we don't even know about, and B, we think they're just a necessary part of life. But they're not, and they impose a cost. They impose a cost on us. Now, there was a study in a major medical journal a few years ago, in 2007. They looked at the immune functioning of people who look after people with Alzheimer's. So here's a people with a brain condition, Alzheimer's, which makes them demented, more demanding, less able to take care of themselves, and they looked at the immune functioning of the caregivers. Now, it's been known for quite a while that looking after others actually imposes a deficit on the immune system. So caregivers of Alzheimer's, if you wound them deliberately, their wounds will take longer to heal than normal. If they get an injection for the influenza, the average, out of 100 people that you give a flu vaccine to, normally about 80% should respond with an immune reaction. Although that didn't happen this year. It was a big failure this year, as you know. But when you give the vaccine to caregivers of Alzheimer's, there's only about a 20% response. So there's something about caregiving, it seems to be, that debilitates the immune system. Now, this new study looked at depression. They found that depressive symptoms were far more common amongst caregivers of Alzheimer's patients. They looked at the functioning of a structure called telomeres. Telomeres are molecular structures at the end of our chromosomes. Our chromosomes, of course, carry our genetic material, the DNA. And at the end of our chromosomes, there are these things called telomeres, which have been compared to the glue at the end of your shoelace. So the glue binds the separate filaments together so the shoelace doesn't unravel. Now, as we get older, the telomere shortens. So shortening telomeres are a sign of aging. And they found a number of times now, for example, the telomeres of mothers who chronically look after sick children are 10 years shorter than their chronological age. They found the same shortening in the telomeres of Alzheimer's caregivers. They also found again that there was significant diminishing of immune cell growth in the caregivers. Can you hear me okay?
A little louder.
A bit louder? I think perhaps I'll have to just, if not, it's better. I'll drop this mic here.
Oh, you know what? Okay.
So the diminished immune cell activity amongst the caregivers of Alzheimer's clients, the chronic caregivers. Now, when I tell you these things, of course, the obvious question is, does this mean we should not look after each other?
No.
Thanks for the answer. Does it mean that the people who say that human nature is intrinsically selfish and that's every person for themselves, does that make that perspective accurate? It's not the caregiving per se that shortens the telomeres, that impairs our body's repair mechanisms, that suppresses our immune activity. It's not the caregiving per se, because human beings are actually programmed and meant to caregive to one another. We're actually wired for attachment. Attachment means the connection between people. And we're wired for attachment for the simple reason that otherwise we could not survive. Human beings did not evolve as rugged individualists. We could not have evolved as rugged individualists because under conditions that obtained under the millions and hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary events that brought us to the level that we're at today, nobody could have survived on their own. And there would have been no recreation or recreation of the species reproduction. And the human infant, being the most helpless and the most dependent of any creature in the universe, and the most immature for the longest period of time. And if you want to know how immature we can stay for a long time, just look at our politicians on any level. Given that, we need caregiving to survive. And we need caregiving to survive when we're older. So we're actually wired for caregiving. We're wired for compassion. So it's not the caregiving, it's not the compassion per se that actually creates the problem. It's something else, which is connected to it. Now, what is that thing then that makes caregiving potentially stressful and potentially harmful? It's how we give care and how we relate to ourselves when we give care, and whether we ourselves are able to recognize that we, the caregivers, also need care. If we don't recognize that latter fact, if we're unable to recognize that, then we create the suffering for ourselves without meaning to. Where I used to write a medical column for a number of years, and these are all clippings from the Globe. The first one is written by a woman who, in the first person, describes her own diagnosis with breast cancer. She goes to the doctor and is told that she's got breast cancer. Now, her husband's name is Hai, and Hai's first wife died of breast cancer. Now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. The doctor's name is Harold. Here's what Donna then subsequently writes in his first person account in the Globe and Mail. Harold tells me that the lump is small and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hai's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die, he reassures me, but I'm worried about Hai. I won't have the strength to support him. Now, has anybody noticed anything alarming about that paragraph? What is that?
The fact that she's more concerned about her husband than she is about her own health.
She's immediately more concerned about her husband's emotional needs. Now, she's the one that's going to go through surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. And her first thought is, how will I support him? So that automatic and compulsive regard for the needs of others without even considering your own, that's a major risk factor for illness. And I'm telling you something. I worked for 20 years in family practice, 7 years. I was medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at Vancouver Hospital, looking after terminally ill people, and categorically, I assert for you that I never saw a single patient with cancer, with ALS, with multiple sclerosis, with chronic arthritis of any kind, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis or other types, with chronic fatigue, with fibromyalgia, with colitis, Crohn's disease, chronic asthma, eczema, psoriasis, any chronic illness whatsoever, who didn't fit the categories I'm about to tell you. And in palliative care, I looked after many people who were dying because they were so good. There's the expression, the good die young. And the obituaries in our newspapers illustrate that all the time. And obituaries are interesting because They tell us not only about the person who died, but also about what we value in one another. And what we value in one another is very often exactly what kills us. Now, 3 weeks ago, I met a man called Steve Fogno. Steve Fogno, as you may recall, is the man who completed the cross-country, one-legged, post-cancer run that Terry Fox initiated but couldn't finish. Fogno was a very troubled character, as you know. He's lost his Order of Canada, he's lost his accolades, gone to drugs, all kinds of stuff afterwards. He just couldn't handle it all. He was brought to me because somebody was making a documentary on his life and they thought speaking to me might help him. And the day after I met him, he was stabbed in the back and now he's in a coma at the Royal Columbia Hospital in New Westminster. But I was thinking about the difference between him and Terry Fox. And Terry, of course, is the Canadian icon. Sweet, good, self-sacrificing, utterly courageous, completely committed to his cause. And does anybody think that those qualities didn't kill him? Does anybody think that him pushing himself to run across the country with cancer in his leg didn't contribute and taken on the stress and the responsibility of all that, and how hard he pushed himself all his life? Does anyone really think that that stress did not contribute to the onset and to the recurrence of his cancer? So we need to be careful as to who we hold up as a model. Now, Fox certainly was a model of courage, of commitment, obviously in significant ways an example to us all. But there is something about his example that ought not to be lauded or emulated, which is the ignoring of the needs of the self. So let me read you these obituaries, and the good do die young. This is a doctor, this is all from the Globe and Mail. This is a doctor who died of cancer, age 55. Never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Toronto's Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties toward his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. But think on that for a moment. If a friend of yours was diagnosed with cancer, is that what you'd advise them to do? That all the while that you're getting treatment and you're dealing with the stress of having this terminal diagnosis, just go to work every day and don't take a moment for yourself. Don't even consider how your relentless pushing of yourself might have contributed to the onset of your disease. Is that what you would advise somebody to do? So this automatic and compulsive and rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the needs of the self is another significant risk factor for illness. And I know that game from within, because I've been one of these workaholic doctors who was completely identified with my role as a doctor. And I didn't know who I was if I wasn't a doctor. And the world loves that. You see, when I was working with addicted clients in the downtown East Side who chewed heroin and cocaine to make themselves feel better temporarily, mostly because they've been so terribly abused as children that they needed the escape. These are the people we have in the jails of our country, people that are abused kids. Every single one of them. Well, they were treated with contempt by society. But me, a workaholic doctor, who also plunged myself into my activities as a way of making myself feel better, as a way of completing myself. Because like my clients, I didn't really like myself. Me, I got a lot of praise. I got a lot of accolades. A lot of people just so admired. Here's this selfless doctor. But it's the same drive as drive to drug addiction, which is a need to escape. So what we admire is very often a cover for some deeper stuff underneath. The next obituary, am I getting heavy enough for you yet? The next obituary is about a woman who died age 55 of cancer. Her name was Naomi. Her husband wrote this one. In her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The worst she could say was "phooey" or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. Now, those of you like me who are married or in a relationship with someone, I'm sure that sometimes you wish that your partner would blend in with the environment in an unassuming manner. The trouble is, if they do, they're gonna make themselves sick. Because the pushing down of healthy anger, which is what this woman did, actually suppresses the immune system. There's a relationship between healthy anger and the immune system. And that's because the mind and the body can't be separated. That's what I'm talking about the whole morning. You can't separate the mind from the body. Unlike my profession does. It totally separates the mind from the body. But in reality, that ain't the scientific truth. And the final one is a physician, also died of cancer at age 71, my age, in Ottawa. Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until their death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day, as his wife Rosalind and their 4 kids waited for him at home. Never wanted to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy, until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. So this guy suffered from 2 fatal beliefs, and literally they're fatal. One is that you're responsible for how other people feel. Secondly, that you must never disappoint anybody. And if those beliefs run your life, believe me, at some point or another, your body's going to say no. You're going to develop symptoms. You're going to start getting migraine headaches, chronic rashes, frequent colds, stomach aches, difficulty sleeping, depression, back pain, neck pain, digestive problems, anxiety, because your body's trying to tell you something. And if you don't listen, then the body will send you stronger messages. Actual illnesses. It takes a long time for human beings, and very hard work to wake up. I know, I can tell you. It's hard work waking up. Still working on it. Now, why is it so hard? Where do all these patterns come from? And I can tell you something, and I won't have time right now to go into too much detail, but it doesn't matter. When I wrote my book, When the Body Says No, which is what this material is based on, I looked at the scientific literature, and I also looked at the biographies of famous people who died of illnesses, like Lou Gehrig and his ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, same type. Gehrig was the one who never missed a game as a baseball player, not because he was never injured. At one point his hands were x-rayed, and it turned out that his fingers had been fractured 17 separate times. And Lou's teammates would describe him as grimacing like a maddened monkey in agony as he fielded the ball with a broken hand, but he would never miss a game. Why? Because he was too dutiful. Dutiful to the owners, to the fans, to his teammates, and above all, to his self-image as the Iron Horse. That was his identity. Not my needs, but my identity. And identity is what we create to compensate for what we don't get in childhood. Lou Gehrig's father was an alcoholic. And any of you who either grew up in alcoholic homes or have witnessed them, you know perfectly well what happens to many children in alcoholic homes. What happens to them? What role do they take on? Anyone? The caregiver role. Automatically they have to. And the roles that we take on as kids become our identities. And we think we're those identities. But we're not. They're just roles that we took on. But if you don't know that, then we'll never do anything that takes us outside of our identity. And then whatever happens, our needs happen to be, they don't matter. What matters is that I keep up the identity. Because I don't know who I am if I'm not that identity. Now, how does this happen? And this happens in the, whether it was Lou Gehrig, whether it was Gilda Radner, the comedian, and ovarian cancer, whether it was Pamela Wallin and her bowel cancer. The same routine over and over again. You go back and look at their childhoods, significant trauma. And it's interesting to read Pamela's autobiography because she denies she was traumatized. She says, I had a perfect childhood, perfect family in a small town. I forget which Prairie province where she was from, but it was in a small Prairie province town. I had a perfect childhood. Then when you actually look at her description of that childhood, there's nothing perfect about it. She describes, for example, how when she was in school in, I don't know, grade 7 or 8 maybe, their teacher would fondle the girl's breasts in the classroom. And Donna, as a mother, wouldn't believe her. But she says, oh, that's okay, we got over it. No problem. So she had to push down her own anger and her own fear, and then pushing down of the emotion then is what pushes down the immune system. Then you're more prone to get cancer. So it begins in childhood. And why does it begin in childhood? Well, let me give you a personal example, which I mentioned in the book. When I was 54 or so 17 years ago, I was visiting my mother. She was in a nursing home. And she was in a nursing home because there's a genetic disease that runs in our family called muscular dystrophy. It's a particular kind of muscle degeneration that happens over time, but it's genetically programmed. Now, very few diseases are genetically programmed, most are not, but that one is. And so that when you have the gene, you're going to get the disease pretty much. So my mother had it, and by the time she was in her 70s and my father had died, she could no longer get out of bed, move around, she could barely lift her arm to feed herself. Mentally, she was completely with it. So I'm visiting her one afternoon in the nursing home, and I have a bit of a limp as I walked on the nursing hall corridors. I have a limp because that morning I had surgery on one of my knees because I used to jog on cement and I tore one of my cartilages, so I had to have this minimally invasive surgery on my knee to remove the torn cartilage. And so that afternoon I have a little bit of a limp which disappears the moment I enter her room. And I don't limp as I leave the room after a visit, but I resume my limp as soon as I close the door behind me. Now, what do you imagine I was doing? What do you think? Protecting her? From what? For being worried about me. Now here's the deal with my mother. She was 78. We're Jews from Hungary. She survived the genocide. She survived the murder of her grandparents in Auschwitz. She survived the absence of my father in forced labor, not knowing whether he was alive or dead for a whole year. She survived the Budapest ghetto with me as a small infant. She survived the communist dictatorship. She survived the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. She survived being a refugee, coming to Canada, new language, new country, new culture, being almost 40 years old and then getting pregnant at that age when she already had 2 adolescent boys, and all the difficulties of immigrant life and adjustment in a new continent. She was an emotionally very strong person. Do you really think she needed to be protected from the fact that her middle-aged son had a bit of a limp the afternoon of surgery? I hadn't thought about it. Had I thought about it for a minute, I wouldn't have suppressed my limp, but it was unconscious, automatic behavior. Why? Because I learned very early that my mother's under so much stress, I better not add to it if I want to maintain my relationship with her. You see, the child's greatest need, the child has 2 needs. The second one I'll tell you about in a minute. But the greatest need is what I mentioned earlier, attachment. Because the infant is utterly helpless, utterly dependent. Therefore, without the attachment relationship, there's no life. So the child will do anything to maintain the attachment relationship. Now, I was born in Budapest, Hungary, 1944, January. When I'm 2 months old, the German army, the Wehrmacht, marches into Budapest. The Jews of Hungary had been the only large Jewish group still unscathed by the genocide, and now was their turn. And they may not have known the horrific details, but they knew something awful was coming. And the day after the German army marches into Budapest, my mother phoned the pediatrician to say, would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time. And the doctor says, of course I'll come and see him, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying. Now as infants, what do we know about genocide, Hitler, Second World War? Nothing. What are we reacting to? Reacting to the pain and stress of our mothers, which the infant feels instinctually, deeply, and which the infant takes personally. It's the only way infants can interpret the world is personally. It's all about them. So I read you a quote about that from a teacher of mine. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. So how does an infant adapt to that kind of pain? Well, if I sense that my mother is already overburdened, and since I have to work very hard to maintain that attachment relationship with her, and this went on for a whole year, this is how we lived for a year under constant threat, then the child learns, my gosh, my mother is already so stressed, like Luke Gehrig learned, that in order to maintain my relationship with her, I have to suppress my own needs and my own pain. And then he becomes this iron horse, and I become this person who, age 3 or 4, years after the war, I have a severe ear infection, and I lie there at 4 in the morning whimpering with pain, but not calling out loud for my parents, because instinctively I had learned when I was a year old or less that they're already too burdened by my pain. So it's an adaptation, in other words. So this self-suppression, this being nice, this taking care of, this identification with the role rather than the needs of the self, these are not mistakes that we make, and they're not conscious either. They're unconscious but automatic adaptations. And because they're unconscious and automatic, we can't let go of them, because we don't even know that we're doing it. We just think that's who we are. That's why I'm talking to you. I want to make you conscious of it. So if you're doing it, stop it. Find out how you got programmed that way and deprogram yourself, which is not going to happen just because you listen to me. But it's going to begin somewhere. So the child has to adapt to the parent. And the parent, of course, is not deliberately hurting the child. The parent is just living his or her life in the way they were programmed. If Lou Gehrig's father was an alcoholic, it was because, as a young child, he, the father, was traumatized. The alcohol was his way of not feeling the pain. But we do pass it on from a generation to the next without meaning to. Just like, trust me, I pass some of it on to my children. Because whenever I work like a doctor, because I'm trying to prove my value, because I didn't have any as an infant, what message do my kids get? That they don't matter, because I'm not around. If they mattered, I'd be sure to spend lots of time with them. But no, I was rather out there delivering other people's babies than looking after my own. So we pass it. So, here it is. There are these kids whose parents are stressed. We have to give them stress hormones to keep their airways open. Why? Because when the parents are stressed, you know, when I've read here to you, when the parent is in pain, the child is in pain. When the parent is stressed, the child is stressed. And that means that the child's stress mechanisms are working overtime and they get exhausted. Now we have to give them extra stress hormones to keep their airways open. And cortisol, which is the stress hormone, is the medicine that we use in every aspect of medical practice. You got a rash? We're going to give you cortisol cream. You have asthma? We're going to give you cortisol. You have inflammation of a joint? We're going to give you cortisol. You have inflammation in your nervous system? We're going to give you cortisol. But we never ask ourselves, The obvious question, gosh, given that we're treating everything with cortisol, could it be that, which is the stress hormone, could it be that stress has something to do with the onset of illness? And it's very straightforward in the case of the asthmatic child. There's nothing mysterious about it. Another study, 500 women in Australia with breast lumps suspicious for malignancy who had to be biopsied to make sure it's not malignant. So they undergo this biopsy, and before the results come back, they have a psychological interview. Turns out that if a woman was emotionally isolated prior to the onset of that lump, that by itself did not increase the risk of that lump being cancerous. Zero effect. Similarly, if a woman was stressed, that also by itself did not increase the risk of that lump being cancerous. But if zero effect, but if a woman was both stressed and isolated, her risk of having cancer was 9 times as great as the average. And the researchers, being left-brained, logical thinking, Mr. Spock, and good memories to Leonard Nimoy, who died yesterday. The Mr. Spock types from emotion doesn't compute, such as we train out by the truckload from our institutions of academic learning. These people that are left-brained, they got no connection to emotion. Therefore, they don't understand the world. They only understand their minds, and not even that very well. This is whom we encourage, and we call PhDs and professors and experts. Well, these doctors, being Mr. Spock types, they couldn't understand how does 0 and 0 add up to 9? How does 0 and 0 multiply to 9? But it's so straightforward, isn't it? Given what I already told you. Let's say Alan, right? Yeah, let's say Alan was stressed. And that means that his hormones of stress, cortisol and adrenaline, would be, raging through his system. And he was upset about something. But let's say sitting next to him is a friend who says, "Hey Alan, I see that you're upset. Do you want to talk about it?" What happens to Alan's stress? Whew. He says, "Yeah, I'm upset." And he takes a deep breath, and he gets more oxygen to his brain, starts thinking clearly, and his adrenaline and cortisol level go down. But if Alan was isolated and stressed, nobody there that he could talk with, what would happen to the stress levels? They would stay high for months. And you know what it's like when something upsetting happens and you don't talk it out with somebody? You just keep stewing over it and stewing over it, and every time you do, your blood pressure goes up and your stress hormone level goes up. And so you're stewing in your own stress juices for months, which suppresses your immune system. The immune system, no wonder that those who are isolated and stressed are 9 times as likely to have cancer. Which means, by the way, people, that the cancer agencies and societies are out to lunch when it comes to looking for the cause of cancer. Because they're always trying to understand the cancer in terms of the mechanism of the cell and the DNA. That's not what the answer is. Because the cell and the DNA exists in a certain environment. And the environment turns genes on and off. We know that. So somebody said, a British researcher said, trying to understand cancer by studying the individual cell is like trying to understand the traffic jam by studying the internal combustion engine. You have to look at the overall environment, and cancer is not the disease of an individual. Cancer reflects a lifetime and a way of living and emotionally experiencing yourself in a certain environment based on certain triggers. You understand cancer? Look at a person's life. Don't just look at their cells. So they'll never ever, doesn't matter how many more hundreds of billions of dollars they spend, they'll never find the answer to cancer by looking at it from that angle. And that's why they haven't found it. You look in the wrong direction, how are you going to find something? Which is not to say they haven't made great discoveries, but for the core issues, because we separate the mind from the body, they'll never find the answer. So let me ask you this question. How many of you had the following experience, that you had a powerful gut feeling about something, you didn't pay attention to it, and you were sorry afterwards? Anybody? Just a few of you, huh? Let me ask you again. How many of you had the experience of having a strong gut feeling about something, ignoring it, and having reason to be sorry afterwards? Now put your hand up if that happened to you. Thank you. The honesty level is getting a bit better now. Well, you see, here's what did you just tell me? You just told, whether you know it or not, you just told me about your childhood. Because have you ever met a one-day-old infant that suppresses their gut feelings? When they're unhappy or sad or in pain, are they going to lie there thinking, oh my gosh, I know I'm sad and tired and afraid and in pain and hungry, but my God, Mom and Dad are working so hard. I should not bother them right now. That's not what you get. You get, ah! That's what's normal. If you learned to suppress your gut feelings, it's only because at some point or another, you got the message from the environment that it's safer for you not to express how you feel. Because your parents couldn't handle it. Maybe they reacted badly to it. Maybe they're just too stressed and you're trying to protect them. I'm just reading the biography of my friend Theo Fleury. And he says, as you know, Theo was captain of Calgary Flames, and he was sexually abused as an adolescent by his hockey coach. The abuse began, or at least the indications of abuse began, a long time before. Theo never told his parents. He says, I had made a choice. I chose to protect them and my secret. Chose to protect my parents from knowing what was happening to him. So Theo learned very early that he had to protect his parents. Now his dad was an alcoholic. He learned very early that he had to protect his mother and father from his own problems. And hence, he made himself available without wishing to, made him sick. There's a move to protect the parent from our feelings. That comes very early in life, if we get that sense that they need that. So, mind and body can't be separated because the attachment system, the emotional system of love and fear is directly connected to our nervous system, obviously, because again, if I made you afraid right now, your nervous system would be awakened in a moment because of the fear. So would your hormonal system be awakened in a moment, adrenaline and cortisol? And so would your immune system. So it turns out that the immune system, the hormonal apparatus, the nervous system, and the emotional system are not separate systems. They're not separate at all. They're one super system. The same apparatus with different parts to it. Different roles, but fundamentally it's all the same role. Either bringing closer what's nourishing or keeping out what's unhealthy. That's what the immune system does, that's what the emotions do, that's what all the systems do. It also means that when we're suppressing one aspect of that system, you're also suppressing and affecting the other parts. And that's the science of it. I could go into much more detail had I had the time, but I don't. At this point, I invite you to consider if this makes sense to you, and if you like to look at the evidence, you can look at my book or many of the books on stress and health and emotional self-suppression. Problems, of course, is every you hear come down with multiple sclerosis or chronic rash or inflammation of your intestines, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. If you go to your doctor, they'll give you cortisol or other medications. Nobody's going to ask you about your childhood. Nobody's going to ask you about your relationship. Nobody's going to ask you how you're not saying no in your life, so your body has to say it for you. That's the limitation of the medical system. But the limitation of the medical system does not reflect reality, it reflects a kind of narrow ideology. And many physicians, including myself, have to learn this after we graduate from medical school. Now, this is the stress on caregivers. And so when you are a caregiver who's automatic and compulsive and you're always ignoring your needs, that's what stresses you. It's not the caregiving as such that stresses you, it's how you relate to it and how you ignore yourself in the process. That's why the diminished immune system, that's why the depression, that's why, by the way, what does depression mean? It's so obvious. When you're depressed, depression means to push something down. So that's what it's all about. Forget all this stuff about biology of depression. Yeah, there's a biology, but where does the biology come from? Because people push down their emotions. That's what it means to depress something. yes, you can be a great caregiver and a compassionate one, and we need to be, all of us. And this group is an example and a call to all of us to be that way. But we cannot do so at our own expense chronically. So look, in a nutshell, and I'll take questions in a moment, it all comes down to this. Who are we actually, where we're not our roles? How do we gain our roles? How do we develop them in childhood? And do we want those roles to dominate our functioning for the rest of our lives? Thank you.